It is the holiday season. It is almost the new year. And this is the time of year that people tend to reflect on the year that's passed and set goals or maybe a word for the year for the new year. Now, today, I want to take some time here on the podcast to talk about how that can be really hard when you have a brain injury, because your life is not a highlight reel. When you're barely managing to get through the day, when you have symptoms and struggles and doctor's appointments and trying to balance learning more about your recovery at the same time as trying to do everything that you need to do, whether it's work or school or life, just getting through the stuff that has to be done around the house. Living with a brain injury is hard. It's harder to think. Your energy is affected. It's harder to just make decisions. It's harder to sleep. It can be harder to do everything, depending on what your symptoms look like personally. If you have vestibular symptoms, you could be dealing with dizziness or lightheadedness and having trouble just sitting up, standing up, walking around. If you have dysautonomia, you could be feeling lightheaded a lot. If you have vision struggles, just looking at a screen or a computer, you could have motor issues, have trouble holding a pen and writing. Brain injury can affect everything. And that doesn't even scratch the surface. And so on most of the episodes of this podcast, we are talking about symptoms, or we're hearing stories from survivors, or I'm interviewing a doctor or a therapist about a particular part of symptoms that has to do with brain injury, and trying to bring you tools and strategies and things to help with your recovery, to aid in information and education, to help you to have the tools to know what to ask your doctors and to know how to move forward. That's a big goal of mine on this podcast, because I spent so many years having absolutely no clue what to do and what was going on inside of my own head. And in recent years, when I found diagnosis of dysautonomia, when I finally was able to understand the root cause of some of the symptoms that I've gone through, it's changed my life. And so my goal with the podcast is to help you all to be encouraged and to bring you hope and tools that you can use to help. Now, today is not going to be one of those episodes that we talk about a particular symptom or that I give you a particular strategy. Rather, I wanted to talk about something a little bit more ambiguous, a little bit more nuanced, a little bit less concrete, and that is this sense of ambiguous loss or grief over the life that you wish you had, or the life that you had before, and kind of how to cope with that and how to move forward, particularly as it relates to the new year, the holidays, reflections. I have had a brain injury for 14 years this month. December 2007 was my first traumatic brain injury. And the first year, I don't even remember. My memory was so messed up. I barely remember the first year after the injury. The second year is still fuzzy, but I know, like, the first 5 years, I was really in the thick of it. The symptoms were constant. I was given a lot of outdated medical advice now that we know is outdated, but in 2007, 2008, doctors would say, rest, don't do too much. Your brain, your concussion will get better over time. Come to find out, I kept getting worse and I kept getting worse. I wasn't getting treatment. And every single day was a struggle. We were having doctors tell my family that I'd probably never finish high school. I was relearning how to get dressed. All the while, they're calling it a mild traumatic brain injury. I can't get myself dressed. I forgot what order my clothes went on. I needed help taking a shower. My short-term memory was so bad I'd forget things constantly. I share this example often. If you've heard me tell my story before, you might have heard this example, but I think it's a good one to explain just the level of how much my memory was affected and my body systems were affected, is that I would forget that I ate. So I would eat a bowl of cereal, I would eat breakfast, then I would go in the other room and think, oh, it's morning, I need to eat breakfast. And I would go right back into the kitchen and pour myself another bowl of cereal or oatmeal or whatever it was that day. Cereal was easy for me to eat back then because it didn't offer a lot of steps. So I could just, put cereal, milk. But then I'd put everything away in the wrong spot. So I'd put the box of cereal in the refrigerator, and then I'd put the milk back in the pantry, which is opposite of where they were supposed to go. And then I would forget that I ate again. And my mom has shared that this could happen 3 or 4 times in one morning. So I would be confused. My gut was pretty messed up, and learning what I know now about the gut and the brain and dysautonomia, when autonomics are affected, there can be a disconnect in that area. I had a lot of gut issues for so many years, but I also lost my ability to have hunger pangs. So I actually didn't feel hungry, but I also didn't feel full. So I would forget that I ate, but I didn't have that feeling of feeling full. So I would just eat. I also had impulse control problems, which I still sometimes struggle with, of overeating. So I would just eat and not be able to control the cravings or the impulses. I would see a commercial for food and I would have to get up and eat something. Like I couldn't control that urge. I had this impulse and I just couldn't handle it. My emotions were out of control. I would throw temper tantrums. We did an episode a couple episodes back about emotions where I talked a lot more about this, which if you haven't listened to, make sure to check out on the podcast feed. There are 2 episodes about emotions this season so far, actually, but I had trouble controlling my emotions. So I would go from extremes of temper tantrums and not being able to control that down to feeling nothing and not being able to relate. My short-term memory, like I said, was pretty bad. I would meet the same people over and over again, forget who they were, forget their names. My long-term memories were also affected. So I used to describe it like my long-term memories were someone else's home movies in my head. So like there are certain things that I would remember, but I didn't have emotional connection to it. It was like, oh, yeah, I guess that happened. But then there were other things that I wouldn't remember at all from my childhood that are just gone. And it was about 8 years until my long-term memories started to resurface. And about the first time that I randomly, referred? I can't think of the word, but that I saw something and it reminded me of something from my childhood. And I randomly said, oh, that reminds me of this. And my family, like their jaws dropped because it was like 8 years later. And suddenly for the first time, I'm referring to my childhood like it's a thing. I'm actually engaging in memories, and those started to come out more and more. I share some of these examples from earlier on in my journey because for a while I constantly felt confused. I felt like my personality had completely changed. I lost my sense of identity. I felt like an empty shell of a person. I, at the same time, struggled with my balance and social cues. I really had a hard time with friends. I really had a hard time in school. And the doctors were telling my parents I'd probably never finish high school. So, I'm just going through life thinking that I'm a failure all the time. Through the years, things started to improve little by little. I started to do a little bit better in school once I had accommodations. I was bullied in the school that I went to when my brain injury happened, and it was just a really, really damaging environment. So we moved. I repeated a grade over again in the new school. So the kids didn't know that I had been repeating a grade because I was so afraid of being bullied. It was so bad in the previous school that the administration had a meeting with my parents and cried. The teachers were crying. The administration was saying, "We're so sorry. We can't control the bullying." The teachers, the administration had no idea what to do. So it was recommended by the doctor that, this isn't going to get better. This isn't good for her recovery if it's possible to get her to a new school. So we moved to a different school district. And in the new school, they had a really good special education program. There was a teacher that was my caseworker that I met with every single day for one period. It was a class called Study Skills, and she taught me how to write in my agenda. She taught me how to organize my schoolwork. She helped me to advocate for myself and talk to the teachers. And so little by little, I started to improve, and by repeating a grade over again in high school, I was able to graduate high school, which the doctors never thought would happen. So that felt like a really big win. I felt like, wow, I actually did it. And around then is when I first started to share my music. So I recorded my first little EP my senior year of high school with some songs that I had been writing through my brain injury recovery. I never wrote a song before I had the brain injury. This is another story for another podcast day, but I started to write music in the brain injury recovery, and music has been a huge part of my recovery. And the theme song for this podcast, called Hope Survives, is one song that I wrote. But back to the topic, right? So I might have gotten a little bit sidetracked, but I wanted to share some of kind of the journey where I came from, because every single day feeling like a failure and every single day not knowing what's happening in your own head, it takes a toll on you. It really, really does. So I was able to graduate high school. I was able, by the grace of God, to go to college. I studied music with a lot of accommodations, and I had more concussions and more brain injuries. And over the years, I've had over a dozen re-injury concussions since that first TBI. So every time I felt like I was starting to make progress, I would fall and hit my head again, and then feel like I just went backwards. And it's so incredibly frustrating to make progress on your recovery and then feel like you're just back to where you were before. So I share all of that context in my story because I actually don't know if I've shared my full story on the podcast, which might be something to do in the future. But I wanted to share that context because I know what it's like to just want the year over with. Just want to get it over with. you don't want to look back. Looking back is hard and annoying and sad and grieving. I remember feeling like everybody else, all my friends, were moving forward in life. They all got their driver's license. I never did. I still can't drive. So right around when my brain injury happened, a couple years later, everyone was getting their learner's permit, driver's license, and I was not. I felt like I was missing milestones in life. As I moved forward into adulthood, young adulthood, people started to get jobs and started to move out of their parents' house and move forward in life. And I just felt so stuck. I have been gratefully blessed with some wonderful opportunities to share my music and to share brain injury advocacy by speaking at conferences and doing some concerts. And that has been a huge, wonderful blessing and highlight in my life. And I don't take that for granted. But even in the middle of those highlights of talking on TV, I was interviewed on TBN by Ephraim Graham twice. Going on TV, I was the Mayo Clinic's, keynote speaker at their brain injury conference. I've spoken at statewide conferences, different states across the U.S., all these highlight reel things, recording my album in Nashville, these amazing opportunities I've been able to do, all the while struggling with symptoms and getting more concussions. And my most recent concussion was just 2 years ago in December 2019. Now, that most recent one, I slipped down the stairs going into my basement and I fell really hard. I didn't hit my head. So at first I thought, oh, maybe I don't have a concussion and it's fine. Turns out I fell so hard. I had a bruise all the way down the side of my body. I jarred my brain enough to give it a concussion. So, fun fact, you don't actually have to have an impact directly on your head to get a concussion. Sometimes gravity will do that for you, and your brain can bounce inside of your skull, and you can still get a concussion even if you don't actually have an impact on your head. Especially with a history of TBI, it's a lot easier to get concussions. So that particular concussion 2 years ago was really disheartening because I was just coming off of, in 2019, I got diagnosed with dysautonomia. I went out to the Functional Neurology Center and did a week of an intensive, and my vestibular system was the best that it had been ever since I'd had my brain injury. And I was finally thinking to myself, I can have symptom-free days, almost. I was getting there. I was finally walking without worrying. I was finally just living without constantly feeling like my brain injury was a constant burden. For the first time in like 12 years, I finally felt like I had gotten to a place in my recovery where I could just be a normal 20-something person. Normal, the word, right? But I finally felt like I was improving. I was thinking about getting my driver's license. I was excited about life. December 2019, fall, another concussion. And that one really affected me. It brought back symptoms that I hadn't had in a really long time, like speech slurring. When I'd been getting tired, my speech would go and it was like I could think the words, but my tongue would not form the words. And I would start slurring my speech all the time. And earlier on, right after my brain injury, I did struggle with speech slurring and right side weakness and a lot of aphasia, forgetting words. But over the years, that became easier. Now, since that 2019 concussion, my speech has been a significant issue. There are still times that it will slur, especially when I'm tired, like uncontrollably, and it's so hard to explain. I actually did a live video on Hope After Hendry one day while it was happening to kind of show people what was going on. But I have to think really hard about how I form my words even now. While I'm speaking on this podcast, I have to actively really think about how I'm forming my words in my mouth all the time. And those are the kind of things people can't see, right? Through your darkest night, hope survives.